And then I'm going to go to my SharePoint here. Okay, we want to look at atheism and see whether it is a foundation for reasoning, whether it is a foundation for rationality, and just what the psychology of atheism leads us to. I'm going to read this. By embracing materialism, the atheist has destroyed the possibility for knowledge, okay, as well as science and technology. Materialistic atheism is a worldview that's easy to refute. So this is going to help us with a bit of evangelism, a bit of dialogue with non-Christians. A materialistic atheist believes that nature is all there is. He believes there's no transcendent God who oversees and maintains creation. Many atheists believe that their worldview is rational and scientific. However, if atheism were true, it would be impossible to prove anything. So let's look at why. Reasoning involves using the laws of logic. These include the laws of non-contradiction, which says that you can't have A and not A at the same time and in the same relationship. So you got to understand something here. So we are now reasoning and we are using laws of logic. The atheist is going to have trouble with this if he believes we're just chemicals. Why is the law true, the laws of logic? Why should there be a law of non-contradiction, or for that matter, any laws of reasoning? Think about this. If we're just chemicals, why are there laws governing reasoning? The Christian can answer this question. For the Christian, there is an absolute standard for reasoning. We are to pattern our thoughts after God's. The laws of logic are a reflection of the way God thinks. The law of non-contradiction is not simply one person's opinion of how we ought to think. Rather, it stems from God's self-consistent nature. God cannot deny himself. And so, the way God upholds the universe will necessarily be non-contradictory. So, we're really looking at some of these laws of logic. Non-contradiction is a major law that governs reasoning. And yet the atheist worldview is full of contradictions. So let's look further. The laws of logic are God's standard for thinking. Since God is an unchanging, sovereign, immaterial being, the laws of logic are abstract, universal, invariant entities. In other words, they are not made of matter. They apply everywhere and at all times. Laws of logic are contingent upon God's unchanging, God's unchanging nature. And they are necessary for logical reasoning. Thus, rational reasoning would be impossible without the biblical God. I repeat, rational reasoning would be impossible without the biblical God because they're not made of matter. The materialistic atheist can't have laws of logic. He believes that everything that exists is material, part of the physical world. But laws of logic are not physical. Laws of logic cannot exist in the atheist world, yet he uses them to try to reason. This is inconsistent. He is borrowing from the Christian worldview to argue against the Christian worldview. The atheist view cannot be rational because he uses things, the laws of logic, that cannot exist according to his own worldview. I like this statement by Dr. Jonathan Sarfati. We must wonder why atheists call themselves free thinkers if they believe thoughts are merely the results of atomic motion in the brain obeying the fixed laws of chemistry. Absolutely vital point. You could not have a free thought if all thought is simply atomic motions obeying chemistry. Atheism is irrational. In arguing that God does not exist, the atheist must use laws of logic that only make sense if God does exist. It's because God exists that reasoning is possible. The atheist can reason, but within his own worldview, he cannot account for his own ability to reason. What would be the atheist response? Well, the laws of logic are just cultural conventions. We might say, if laws of logic are just conventions, then they are not universal. Rational debate would be impossible if the laws of logic were conventional, because the two opponents could simply pick different standards for reasoning. Each would be right according to his own arbitrary standard. The atheist might say this: the laws of logic are material. They're made of electrochemical connections in the brain. We could say this, but then the laws of logic are not universal. They would not extend beyond the brain. In other words, we couldn't argue that contradictions cannot occur on Mars, since no one's brain is on Mars. In fact, if the laws of logic are just electrochemical connections in the brain, then they would differ somewhat from person to person, because everyone has different connections in their brain. The atheist might say this: we use the laws of logic because they work. We would say, we all agree the laws of logic work. They work because they're true. The question is, why do they exist in the first place? How can the atheist account for absolute standards of reasoning like the laws of logic? How can non-material things like laws exist if the universe is material only? The atheist might say this: as a last resort, the atheist may give up a strictly materialistic view and agree that there are immaterial universal laws. If an atheist is willing to concede that immaterial, universal, unchanging entities can exist, then he must consider the possibility that God exists. But this concession to materialism does not save the atheist's position. He must still justify the laws of logic. Why do these laws exist? And what is the point of contact between the material physical world and the immaterial world of logic and thinking? In other words, why does the material universe feel compelled to obey immaterial laws? See, these are such good points to discuss and dialogue with atheists. Conclusion: the atheist cannot answer these questions. His worldview cannot be justified. It is arbitrary and thus irrational. In conclusion, clearly, atheism is not a rational worldview. It is self-refuting, because the atheist must first assume the opposite of what he is trying to prove in order to be able to prove anything. As Dr. Cornelius Van Til put it, atheism presupposes theism. The laws of logic require the existence of God, and not just any God, but the Christian God. Only the God of the Bible can be the foundation for knowledge. Proverbs 1:7, Colossians 2:3. Since the God of Scripture is immaterial, sovereign, and beyond time, it makes sense to have the laws of logic that are immaterial, universal, and unchanging. Since God has revealed himself to man, we are able to know and use logic. Since God made the universe, and since God made our minds, it makes sense that our minds would have an ability to study and understand the universe. But if the brain is simply the result of mindless evolutionary processes that conveyed some sort of survival value in the past, why should we trust its conclusions? If the universe and our minds are simply the results of time and chance, as the atheist contends, why would we expect that the mind could make sense of the universe? How could science and technology even be possible? So, if the atheist believes that we are just matter, he has a self-refuting view that materialism does not work. If materialism is true, then we cannot change our minds, really. We can only experience the electrochemical reactions that are happening in our brains. In other words, we have no free will whatsoever. We are simply victims to whatever processes our body and our outside events that we come into contact with cause. We are not making decisions, but our brain is just following the rules of chemistry and physics. A purely material origin for the mind leads to determinism, which can be seen as contradictory. If my mental processes are totally determined, I am totally determined either to accept or reject determinism. But if the sole reason for my believing or not believing X is that I am causally determined to believe it, I have no ground for holding that my judgment is true or false. Rational thinking, science, and technology make sense in a Christian worldview. The Christian has a basis for these things. The atheist does not. Atheists can be rational, but they have no rational basis for their rationality within their own worldview. Atheists can be moral, but they have no basis for that morality according to their worldview of materialism. Atheism is a bundle of contradictions. The atheist reasons and does science, yet he denies the very God that makes reasoning and science possible. On the other hand, the Christian worldview is consistent and makes sense of human reasoning and experience. So here we can see that atheist psychology, which covers those three worldviews of the worldview of atheism and three varieties of Marxism, secular humanism, and postmodernism, reasoning and rationality are not even possible within an atheist worldview that believes man is only matter and that our mind is the brain and that we are just chemicals. So the atheist worldview is irrational and has no basis for being able to claim that with a chemical mind, a chemical brain, we can understand things going on outside of our own bodies. So we have the laws of logic, we have the laws of the universe, all are non-material. Atheism can provide no basis for answering the questions of where do we get any laws of logic, any laws of reasoning. And so in psychology, the atheist worldview is contradictory. And we, as Christians, have a far more intelligent worldview and belief about human nature that fits the facts of reality better than atheism. And so we are compelled by the facts of reality, by the facts of our experience, by the fact that we have free will, by the fact that we can change our mind. All these things prove the existence of God is the best possible answer for the universe. And atheism should not be taught to every child in our school system as the reality of the universe.